Hi folks, I'm Gardner Goldsmith, and this is College Unbound Series 1, Part 9, and it's going to be a big one. It's on fascism and regulation, and it doesn't merely look at places such as Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. It turns the lens back on the United States to see what many Americans won't admit about how much fascism has actually been incorporated into the U.S. political system. Get ready. Hi everyone. You know, one of the mixed blessings of studying and understanding collectivism is that many of its ideological themes and the organizations that push them never go away. They, like the ability to learn from their errors, are evergreen. Thus, at any time, one can look at an organization such as Antifa and see that it's not only teeming with hypocrites who use aggressive, destructive fascist tactics to supposedly fight fascism, one also can see that Antifa is a Marxist collectivist organization. Of course, many Antifa members might not like the wider population knowing that their club-wielding club has more in common with real historical fascism than they let out. But let's use that organization as a diving board, first by learning a bit about its origin, and then to learn about our next big area of collectivist analysis, fascism, and how fascism, like other forms of collectivism, has become a poisonous part of the American political system. First, Antifa. Its U.S. members might not know it, or if they do, they might not want word to spread, but anyone familiar with the history of the organization knows that Antifa was conceived in the Soviet Union as a government plan to infiltrate Nazi Germany and draw the Nazi National Socialists into the world collectivist cause. As Joshua Phillips writes for the Epoch Times, quote, "The organization can be traced to the United Front of the Soviet Union's Communist International, Comintern, during the Third World Congress in Moscow in June and July 1921, according to the German booklet 80 Years of Anti-Fascist Action by Bernd Langer, published by the Association for the Promotion of Anti-Fascist Culture. Langer is a former member of the Autonome Antifa, formerly one of Germany's largest Antifa organizations, which disbanded in 2004. And he adds that Antifa, quote, was initially part of the Soviet Union's front operations to bring about communist dictatorship in Germany. End quote. This was when Soviet leader Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, was in the middle of his destruction of free speech, control of the press, and purge of private property and dissenters that saw the slaughter of thousands under his party rule, and which soon led to the murder of millions on Stalin's orders. The dangerous truth is that Antifa has never been for the little guy, nor has it stood against political power. It has been a creation of Marxists and a tool to agitate and work for the institution of Marxist collectivist ideology. And the only remarkable difference between Antifa and the fascists it supposedly fights is that Antifa is in favor of world collectivism, while fascists embrace nation-based collectivism. In his remarkable book, The Problem with Socialism, Loyola University professor of economics Thomas DiLorenzo offers readers an excellent picture of the rhetorical legerdemain employed to draw a false distinction between these two branches of collectivism. Quote, after World War II, the socialist dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, engineered a rhetorical/propaganda coup with the help of the worldwide socialist movement by repeating the notion that the only alternative to Russian socialism was fascism. Classical liberalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom, free market economics, peace, and constitutionalism, was treated as though it never existed. Indeed, it was conflated with one of its deadliest enemies and opponents, fascism. Such an ongoing narrative is used for two main purposes. First, it portrays individualist-oriented capitalism as fascist. And second, it hides the connection between the progenitors of fascism and the collectivism they actually embraced. As DiLorenzo notes, quote, "The truth is that fascism was always a form of socialism. Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascist Italy, had been an international socialist before a national socialist, the latter being the essence of fascism." And DiLorenzo refers readers to a key reference to the 1933 essay Nazi Socialism by Austrian economist F.A. Hayek, in which he said, quote, "The socialist character of National Socialism, Nazism, has been quite generally unrecognized," end quote. So let's recognize it. As the well-known writer on economics, history, and philosophy, Sheldon Richman, notes, quote, "As an economic system, fascism is socialism with a capitalist veneer. The word derives from fasces, the Roman symbol of collectivism and power, a tied bundle of rods with a protruding axe. In its day, the 1920s and 1930s, fascism was seen as the happy medium between boom and bust prone liberal capitalism, the booms and busts caused by central bank fractional reserve inflation, not free markets, with its alleged class conflict, wasteful competition, and profit-oriented egoism, and revolutionary Marxism, with its violent and socially divisive persecution of the bourgeoisie. Fascism substituted the particularity of nationalism and racialism, i.e. blood and soil, for the internationalism of both classical liberalism and Marxism," end quote. In The Problem with Socialism, DiLorenzo notes, quote, "Human beings own themselves, the individualist philosophy contends, and should not be viewed as pawns in political chess games operated by politicians, or as human rats to be experimented upon by social engineers. Socialists believe exactly the opposite. As expressed by Mussolini himself, quote, "The maxim that society exists only for the well-being and freedom of the individuals composing it does not seem to be in conformity of nature's plans, which care only for the species and seem ready to sacrifice the individual," end quote. This idea, continues DiLorenzo, that individuals can be and should be sacrificed for the, quote, "greater good," end quote, is the essence of the fascist, socialist, collectivist philosophy, end quote. Indeed, Mussolini certainly missed the easy-to-see logic that his vaunted group is merely a label attached to people and is always composed of individuals, always reducible to individuals. DiLorenzo continues, quote, "Mussolini declared classical liberal ideas to be dead when he pontificated that, quote, if the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state. If classical liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government," end quote. And as DiLorenzo notes, Italian fascist apologist Fausto Pitigliani said, quote, "The function of private enterprise is assessed from the standpoint of public interest, and hence an owner or director of a business undertaking is responsible before the state for his production policy," end quote. Please remember that quote. That's extremely important to recall when assessing the current state of economic liberty in the United States and how blind many contemporary Americans are to American fascism. Finally, on the subject of Italian fascism, Professor DiLorenzo offers observations about the collectivist philosophy put into practice by Il Duce and his ruling party. Quote, "Consequently, the Mussolini regime established government regulatory agencies that dictated orders to every business, every industry, and every labor union, all in the name of government coordination. It achieved the basic aims of socialism, government control of the means of production, while leaving corporate managers in place," end quote. Again, I'm stressing, I hope you are really focusing on how this translates to the United States. Sheldon Richman observes, quote, "Under fascism, the state, through official cartels, controlled all aspects of manufacturing, commerce, finance, and agriculture. Planning boards set product lines, production levels, prices, wages, working conditions, and the size of firms. Licensing was ubiquitous. No economic activity could be undertaken without government permission. Levels of consumption were dictated by the state, and excess incomes had to be surrendered as taxes or loans. The consequent burdening of manufacturers gave advantages to foreign firms wishing to export. But since government policy aimed at autarky, or national self-sufficiency, protectionism was necessary. Imports were barred or strictly controlled, leaving foreign conquest as the only avenue for access to resources available domestically. Fascism was thus incompatible with peace and the international division of labor, hallmarks of liberalism."
There was this famous fascist motto, everything for the state, everything within the state, nothing against the state.
And again, by liberalism, we mean classical liberalism. And among many other excellent observations in his Library of Economics and Liberty Peace, Sheldon Richman adds, quote, "The fascist leader's antagonism to communism has been misrepresented as an affinity for capitalism. In fact, fascist anti-communism was motivated by a belief that in the collectivist milieu of early 20th century Europe, communism was its closest rival for people's allegiance. As with communism, under fascism, every citizen was regarded as an employee and tenant of the totalitarian party-dominated state. Consequently, it was the state's prerogative to use force or the threat of it to suppress even peaceful opposition." End quote. And Richman offers this revealing Mussolini quote, "The citizen in the fascist state is no longer a selfish individual who has the antisocial right of rebelling against any law of the collectivity. The fascist state, with its corporative conception, puts men and their possibilities into productive work and interprets for them the duties they have to fulfill." End quote. How sweet. So, fascism isn't the capitalist authoritarian enemy that Western socialists label it as such. Fascism is authoritarian National Socialism collectivism, the fraternal twin of what Western socialists embrace. And German fascists followed Mussolini's pattern, echoing his adoration for Marxism and collectivism, with the addition of the colorful Aryan hereditary narrative. Di Lorenzo reminds readers that in his 1925 treatise Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler said, quote, "The Aryan is not greatest in his mental qualities as such, but in the extent of his willingness to put all his abilities in the service of the community. He willingly subordinates his own ego to the community, and, if the hour demands, even sacrifices it." End quote. Does that sound familiar? And Di Lorenzo notes, quote, "This was the basic philosophy of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, expressed under the slogan, quote, 'The common good comes before the private good,' end quote." Which is, of course, a tautological slogan, since, as I noted earlier, the common good is nothing more than individuals deciding for themselves what is good. But this collectivist fallacy goes back centuries. Folks might recall how Rousseau claimed that what he called the general will would be determined by the government assembly, that it would decide for everyone how to live and would be, of course, unquestionable. Like the collectivist fascists, for Rousseau, the government will stood in opposition of the will of all, as he called it, or actual individuals making their own decisions and reflecting their preferences through free will in the market. Also, as we noted, free market economists such as Karl Menger observed that valuation of good and bad can only be determined by individuals using their free will. It's impossible to claim that there's a government-determined common good. Yet this is precisely the mindset that cemented itself into the minds of Italian and German fascists, as well as Soviet communists, Chinese communists, Cuban communists, and on and on. And it's the rallying cry of many people in the West today. Richmond notes that many Western leaders, so-called, actually praised Mussolini as he pioneered his National Socialist policies. Winston Churchill had been a fan and, quote, in the United States, beginning in 1933, the constellation of government interventions known as the New Deal had features suggestive of the corporate state. The National Industrial Recovery Act created code authorities and codes of practice that governed all aspects of manufacturing and commerce. The National Labor Relations Act made the federal government the final arbiter in labor issues. The Agricultural Adjustment Act introduced central planning to farming.
But the tenants and farm laborers were confused by a government scheme to try to raise prices by destroying crops. They found it was the landowners who benefited.
Gavin, crop's looking fine now, boy. I think you come around all right.
Yes, I sure do think so, Cap.
You did what you were told to do on the farm. The owner come out and said, well, you know, we got to ply up every third row of this cotton because the government said we got too much. And you just go out there and leave 2 rows and ply up 1. You wouldn't explain nothing about the pay of everything. It was quite discouraging to think, well, I made this, now I got to ply it up.
Nearly half the cotton fields were plowed up or left fallow.
The object was to reduce competition and output in order to keep prices and incomes of particular groups from falling during the Great Depression. End quote. That's right. When consumers were strapped for cash and their livelihoods were dead, FDR made sure to increase their costs of living. God forbid consumers actually get to save a few pennies and spend them on businesses the government didn't favor. Nah, no way. Decisions regarding buying and selling had to be made by the enlightened ones in their tax-funded offices. What FDR didn't understand, and what other central planners never ever embrace, is the fact that the object of free trade is not to see certain sectors of the economy kept alive or even for more people to work per se. If that were the case, we could stop using the wheel and internal combustion engine and make life harder, to force ourselves to put more effort into things that we create tools to help us to actually do. We could take 2 people to work on projects that formerly took 1. The object of a productive economy is to make life easier, to help us labor less for each thing that we want, thus freeing up cash or human potential to be applied to other areas of our lives that we can then improve. This principle goes back to the division of labor among Paleolithic man, which is really when it all began, not with so-called settled agriculture, as some teachers have claimed was the origin of division of labor. Paleolithic people saw the old and the childbearing stay in the cave, doing certain tasks, while the stronger, more agile went on the hunt. Indeed, even those ancient, supposedly uncivilized hominids divided their labor to become more productive, increasing their chances to survive and become more comfortable and live longer. But in today's world, fascist collectivists want to tell people how to offer jobs, how to work, and what we will pay to those people who are working to offer us things. And when politicians can tell businesses how to operate, this fascistic power creates vast new areas where special interests will game the system to their advantage. Economists call that rent seeking, or the attempt to gain at the expense of consumers and competitors. And it's at the heart of crony-capitalism, originally termed mercantilism by 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith, whom we previously mentioned in this series. It's not capitalism in any way, but it is often what contemporary leftists believe to be capitalism. It's a way for the politically connected to gain not by being more entrepreneurial, not by serving the consumer, but by, as Professor Thomas Woods Jr. says, becoming political entrepreneurs, getting politicians to pass statutes such as licensing laws, wage mandates, expensive safety mandates, and tariffs, or to attack businesses through antitrust suits, all to hamstring competitors or block potential competitors. Which brings us to the United States. Any rational observer of today's innumerable government edicts, so-called regulations, licensing demands, and other euphemistically named compliance codes forced on American businesses must acknowledge that we struggle beneath a nation-state and constituent political bodies that have imposed myriad creeping forms of fractional fascism, splinters of the Italian fasces that dig into our freedom and show us just how threateningly collectivist this nation is. From Leviathan federal agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for decades of suffering and millions of deaths because people could not get important drugs that the FDA delayed.
Rational people would never consider themselves to be better off because their range of choice had been arbitrarily limited. Yet, such restrictions of consumer choice, affecting both patients and their physicians, fetters consumers at all times in the United States. The Food and Drug Administration, which I'll just call the FDA alone decides whether a newly devised medical good, either a drug or a device, may be sold. Many potentially beneficial goods remain on the shelf for a decade or more, while their manufacturers traverse the rigid and elaborate testing procedures required by the FDA before it will approve marketing of the good.
To the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which tells business owners, employees, and consumers what the safety standards in shops must be, and by extension, how much business owners and consumers and employees will have to shell out for all of those mandates, regardless of participant satisfaction. Year after year, the central government creates fascistic commands, while most Americans don't realize the commands are, strictly speaking, fascist. One of the best examples of the Marxist nature of this fascist command and control system is the minimum wage mandate. Let's check it out. Befitting the economic definition of fascism, i.e., the nominal, in name only, ownership of business that is told how to operate according to state diktats, something Rousseau would have found very nice, so-called minimum wage statutes negate owner control of private property and replace it with collectivist political control. What happens when, using that classic David versus Goliath imagery and painting business owners as Goliath, politicians use the collectivist power of the state to make employers pay employees more? As Brad Palumbo observes for the Foundation for Economic Education, political imposition of higher costs lead to decreases in demand. Quote, labor is a product like any other. If the cost of soda was artificially mandated at $10 per can by the government, the simple fact is that consumers would buy less of it. When employers are legally forced to pay more for labor than it is worth in the market, they naturally and inevitably do the same. It's common sense. The idea that potential employees are at some kind of disadvantage and are exploited by employers misses the fundamental axiom of trade. Be it a trade for goods or a trade for services, we're all sellers and consumers, which means we're merely people engaging in trades to better our lives. The employer is not only a seller of goods, He's a buyer of raw materials and a buyer of the skills the employee can offer. The employee is trading labor and skills for the location, tools, power, and promised paycheck the employer can offer, thanks to the employer plunking down investment in all of those and even promising wages before a company can turn a profit. The retail consumer is a participant who also is offering something while looking for the best bang for his buck. After all, the entire goal of a productive economy is to get more for one's efforts, not less. The employer, the employee, and the consumer are all trading and measuring their gains by engaging in the trades. Menger's lesson in subjective valuation is very important here. Like the employees, the employers are dependent on the consumer. And if the consumer is unwilling to pay a higher rate for something, he or she will turn to an alternative or simply hold on to the cash. Thus, if certain skills the potential employee offers aren't worth enough to match what the end consumer is willing to pay, the potential employee will not have a job. It's as simple as that. And employees aren't the only ones who compete. Employers compete for good employees. And they all compete for the consumer's buck. Like all participants, if a good employee doesn't see an offer he or she wants, he or she can go elsewhere or directly appeal to the end consumer and see if the consumer will buy his or her stuff. Should politicians tell any consumer to pay more? They do through minimum wage mandates. I can't, in good conscience, entertain the delusional conceit of speaking for the World War II veterans whose stones pepper this cemetery. But I can speak for my father and his brother, who fought fascists in order to liberate innocent millions. Brothers who at the time didn't quite recognize the growing shadow of anti-constitutional, anti-individualist fascism and socialism rising here in the U.S. I can speak of how my father Paul began to recognize it at the close of the war, how he taught me the ethics of individual will and free markets, and wrote notes for his kids inside the greatest works of philosophy and economics, how he recognized that the Marxist, Rousseauian, collectivist lineage of those he fought was seeping into American colleges, American public schools, American jurisprudence, American politics, American culture as well, all through the envy-based, collectivist, guilt-pushing, rights-denying calls for equality of outcome and democracy and socialist redistribution of wealth that we see today. Now, he's gone, and he's left it up to us and our progeny to stand for truth. So we ask ourselves, in a world where politicians take nearly half our earnings, even as they demonize the peaceful market system that allows for valuation and profit, in a world where governors and mayors claim the so-called moral or legal authority to label our peaceful, life-sustaining jobs as essential or non-essential, where they shut down churches and shops, where they demand so-called licenses merely to offer people food, where they abscond with our earnings to burn it in the intellectual incinerators of government-run schools and further inculcate new generations in the grand worship of the state. In a world where Americans actually applaud technocratic elites who silence dissent and truth, can we stay blind to the anti-individualist fascism and collectivism behind it? At this most crucial time, can we not continue the fight against that growing American collectivism and for the sovereignty of the individual soul? I think I know what my father would say. Hey, thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. If you get the opportunity, share these videos and share the entire series with your friends. Send them the link. Remind them that it's all free. There's nothing attached to it. And if you know people who are interested in homeschooling, this might be a terrific package for them. If you get the opportunity as well, send us a message. Let us know what you think about the video series. We put a lot of work into it, and hopefully it's something that can stand the test of time. Well, thanks again, everyone. I know this has been a big one, and there's a lot of information here. Every one of these segments could stand its own series. It's incredible. All these different characters and subjects and crazy things that have happened in world history. But for now, I'll say thank you for watching. For MRC, I'm Gardner Goldsmith. Be seeing you. I hope you like what we're creating. This new endeavor is designed for you, and I hope you'll link through to the official site and sign on. You'll get special access to all the new videos, you'll get the fun quizzes you can take anytime, and you'll get special ideas to share with friends at this crucial time to gain in wisdom. It's all free. I hope you'll get in there and enjoy it.